The train was late. He had been waiting on the platform for almost 20 minutes, pacing with the kind of aimlessness that comes from knowing you have nowhere to be urgently but still feeling the need to move. The air was cold, not the bitter kind, but sharp enough to cut through layers and remind you of your own skin. He checked his phone more times than necessary, not out of expectation but habit, then boarded without really thinking, found his seat by the window, and dropped into it with the ease of someone used to traveling alone. He didn't notice her right away. The car filled slowly, business travelers, students, a family with too many bags. He barely registered them. His headphones were in, a podcast playing low in the background, not to engage but to distract. He watched the platform blur into motion as the train began to move, and only then, just as the station fell behind them, did he glance across the table. She was already there. Her coat draped neatly over her lap. A book in one hand. The other resting on the table, still and pale, fingers relaxed. Her face was angled slightly away, toward the window. But he knew. Instantly. Recognition hit him not in the mind, but in the body, a sudden pressure in the chest, the short breath, the instinct to look again, and again, and again. It was her. His fiancée. Ex-fiancée. Years ago. There was no doubt. Her hair was different now, darker, shorter, and the lines around her eyes were new, but the way she held herself, the tilt of her chin, the way she pushed her lower lip slightly inward when concentrating, all of it was the same. Unmistakably. Devastatingly. And yet, she gave no sign of seeing him. Not a flicker of the eye. Not a pause in her reading. Not the startled half-smile that comes when you unexpectedly recognize someone. Nothing. She turned a page, shifted her legs slightly, sipped from a cup of tea she had already placed on the edge of the table. As if he weren't there. As if they hadn't shared a home, a future, a life that had almost begun. He wanted to speak. He didn't. Because the weight of her silence was not neutral, it was intentional. She wasn't pretending not to notice him because she hadn't. She was pretending because she had. And that told him more than any word ever could. He watched her for what felt like too long, unsure whether the ache in his chest was nostalgia or something more precise, like shame dressed in memory, grief dressed in form. Her face, though older, though changed, still carried the shape of every morning they once shared, every argument they didn't finish, every laugh that had once broken the monotony of quiet domesticity. He remembered the softness of her breath in sleep, the sharpness of her mind when she was angry, the gentleness in her voice when she wanted something but didn't want to ask. All of that lived in her still, or at least in the version of her he now saw, framed by a moving window and the low hum of a train going nowhere quickly enough. And yet she said nothing. And so did he. Until the silence between them, swollen and deliberate, became unbearable, not for what it withheld, but for what it preserved. Because the longer they said nothing, the more it became clear, this wasn't avoidance. This was memory, made physical. And he, for once, decided not to let it pass. He cleared his throat softly. Not to speak, just to exist. Just to see if sound alone would shift the balance between presence and absence. Her eyes did not move from the page. Her hands did not twitch. But her breath changed, almost imperceptibly, the way it does when someone is bracing for a conversation they hoped would never happen. You don't have to pretend, he said, quietly, gently, not accusing, not demanding, just naming what had already filled the space between them. She turned a page. Another pause. Then, without looking at him, she replied, I'm not pretending. I'm choosing. Her voice was the same. He sat back slightly, absorbing the weight of it, understanding, instantly, that whatever he'd imagined would unfold here, whatever small fantasy he'd nurtured about closure, reconciliation, even simple recognition, was not welcome. And yet he remained. You look well, he said. It was a useless phrase, and they both knew it, but he had to place something in the air to hold on to, something that could make this feel less like standing on the edge of a cliff with no ground beneath. She looked at him, finally, And in that gaze was everything he feared and longed for: calm detachment, controlled history, the kind of stillness that only comes when a person has buried something deeply enough to live above it. Her eyes met his without flinching. "You used to say that even when I wasn't," she said, not with malice, but with the kind of precision that slices cleaner than cruelty ever could. He nodded. Because it was true. He had told her she looked beautiful when she was unraveling. Had told her things would be fine when he didn't know if they would. Had been the voice of steadiness when she needed honesty. And eventually, he had said nothing at all, when she needed something most. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said. "Especially not like this." She sipped her tea. The train curved slightly, and the shadows moved across the table like waves pulling backward. She looked out the window again before answering. "And what would you have done differently, if you had known?" He didn't respond. Because he didn't know. Because the answer would change nothing. Because regret is a language too heavy to speak in confined spaces. Another stretch of silence. Then, quietly, she said, "I almost called you, once." He turned to her fully now, heart thudding not with hope, but with the sharp edge of curiosity. "When?" "3 years ago. I found an old box of things, letters, a photo, a key. I sat on my kitchen floor and thought, maybe I'll call. Just to see if your voice still sounds the same." "Why didn't you?" She smiled. Not from humor. From conclusion. "Because I realized I wasn't calling you. I was calling the version of you I missed. And I already knew he wouldn't answer." They fell quiet again. But this silence was different now. Not cold. Not punishing. Just full. Just true. When her stop was announced, she stood slowly, adjusted her coat, and for a moment, she looked at him, not with anger, not with affection, but with something he couldn't quite name. Something close to forgiveness, but quieter. Something like respect, or simply the end of waiting. As she stepped away, he didn't ask for her number. She didn't offer a goodbye. But before she reached the end of the carriage, she paused, looked over her shoulder, and said, "I kept the key. Not because I hoped. Just because it once opened something real." And then she was gone. The seat across from him remained warm for several minutes after. And he, for the first time in years, allowed himself to sit with the truth that some stories don't need a second chapter to be complete. They only need a final sentence.